What if some of the spiritual practices that we were taught to be afraid of weren't considered evil? What if somebody had to teach us to see them that way? And then what happens when generations go by and nobody even remembers who taught us to be afraid of it in the first place? That's what I want to talk about today, because in my last Shadow Side of Spirituality video, when we talked about the witch wound, I mentioned colonization. I said we were going to eventually have to talk about what happened when people were separated from their ancestral practices and what happened to those practices afterwards. And then somebody in the comments said, well, where's the colonization video, please? And I had to say to myself, you know what? She's right. I haven't done it. So here we are.
Stay awakened. Stay rooted.
Grace and Peace Rooted Collective, welcome back to Awakened and Rooted. This is another conversation in the shadow side of spirituality, and I want to say right up front that this is a massive subject. I am not about to sit here and try to explain all of colonization, all of African spirituality, indigenous spirituality, Christianity, slavery, and hundreds of years of history in one YouTube video. We would be here until next Tuesday if I did that. What I really want to talk about is the spiritual part of it. What happens when one group of people has enough power to tell another group, the way you understand God is wrong? Because colonization wasn't only about land. It wasn't only about resources. It also affected the way people were allowed to understand themselves. And I don't think we talk about that enough. Think about this. You already have a way of understanding the spiritual world. You have beliefs about life and death. Maybe you have ways of honoring the people who came before you. There are practices around healing, nature, family, community. That worldview makes sense to you because it belongs to your people. And then somebody else comes in with enough authority to say, no, that's not sacred. That's superstitious. Or maybe worse than superstitious. Maybe now it's sinful. Maybe it's demonic. Maybe something that your family has practiced for generations suddenly has a completely different name attached to it. And this is a part that really gets me. Who gets to decide what counts as religion and what counts as superstition? Because depending on who has the power, the exact same type of behavior can be interpreted very differently. One person can believe they are communicating with God, and we call that prayer. Someone from another tradition talks about communication with ancestors or spirits. Suddenly we're uncomfortable. One tradition can have sacred objects and nobody questions it. Another tradition has sacred objects and somebody calls them idols. And I'm not saying all religions are exactly the same. They're not. What I'm saying is that we have to pay attention to who had the authority to name everybody else's practices. Because words like primitive, pagan, superstitious, witchcraft, those words did something. They shaped the way people saw themselves. And this is why I don't think erased always tells the whole story. Some things were absolutely lost. There were languages lost, traditions broken. People were separated from communities that would have taught them what things meant. That's real. But sometimes a practice didn't disappear. People just learned not to talk about it. And we know how families do this. You can grow up with something being completely normal in your house and not realize until you're an adult that everybody else didn't do it. You ask your mother why she does something and she says, I don't know, that's what my mother did. Then you ask your grandma and she says, my mother did it too. And that's as far back as anyone knows. Nobody remembers where it came from. It's just your family. And I wonder how often that happens with things that once had spiritual meaning. At what point does a spiritual practice become a cultural practice? And then at what point does it become, that's just something grandma used to do? That fascinates me. Now, when I say ancestral practices survive, I don't want anybody to hear me saying that everything survived exactly as it was. Because think about what happened during the transatlantic slave trade alone. People were taken from different places. They didn't all speak the same languages. They didn't all have the same spiritual traditions. They were separated from the elders and the communities that would have passed down the knowledge. Then they were living in a completely different place under completely different circumstances. Of course, things changed. They had to. So, survival might not look like preserving something perfectly. Sometimes survival is adaptation. Sometimes you hold on to the parts you can. Sometimes traditions meet each other and become something different. And sometimes you practice one religion while carrying the pieces of another worldview with you. That's where we get into syncretism. And syncretism is basically what happens when two spiritual traditions meet and begin to blend together. People may adopt parts of a new religion without completely letting go of the worldview that they already had. And this is where the history gets really interesting because there are African diasporic traditions where African spiritual beliefs interacted with Christianity, particularly Catholicism, and developed into something that carried pieces of both. That tells me people weren't simply sitting there waiting for someone else to tell them what to believe. People were interpreting what they were being given through the worldview they already had. Now, I know somebody is probably waiting for me to say, so Christianity is just the colonizer's religion. No, I'm not saying that. And I don't think this conversation is useful if I make it that simple. There were people who came before Christians and genuinely believed. There were enslaved people who found hope in Christianity. There were Black communities that took Christianity and created something that spoke directly to liberation and survival. That history matters too, but acknowledging that does not mean that we have to ignore the other part of the story. Christianity was also used by people in power to justify things that I think most Christians today would consider completely contrary to Christianity. Both things can be true. And this is actually one of the reasons I wanted to create the Shadow Side of Spirituality series. Because I'm interested in those places where the answer isn't neat. I don't want to replace Christianity good, ancestral spirituality bad with ancestral spirituality good, Christianity bad. That's not examining anything. That is just switching sides. I am more interested in asking, how did power affect what people were allowed to believe? And what happened afterwards? This is the part I keep coming back to because when I think about the generations that came after colonization and slavery, I wonder what survived without anybody consciously saying, I am preserving an ancestral spiritual practice. Maybe nobody called it that anymore. Maybe it was just something somebody did when there was a death in the family or something your grandmother believed about dreams. Maybe there was a certain thing people did for protection, but nobody thought of it as a spiritual practice. Maybe somebody prayed to Jesus and still had beliefs that, if you traced them far enough back, came from somewhere much older. And I'm intentionally not going to sit here and give you a checklist and say, if your grandmother did this, it means she was practicing African spirituality. Because I don't know that. And neither does TikTok. Families develop traditions for all kinds of reasons, but I do think it's worth asking where some of those traditions came from, especially when you find the same kinds of beliefs showing up repeatedly in communities where ancestors came through similar histories. That's when it gets interesting. And I think that's part of what's happening now. There are people who are looking back. They're asking questions about what their ancestors believed before slavery, before colonization, before conversion. And sometimes that questioning comes because they've realized, wait a minute, I was taught that this thing was evil, but why was I taught that? Who taught the person who taught me? And where did they get it from? That question doesn't automatically mean that the thing that you were taught to fear is something that you should practice now. I think that's important. Questioning a belief does not mean that you have to immediately replace it with another belief. Sometimes questioning is just questioning. Sometimes the answer might actually be, no, this still isn't for me. But now at least you know why. You made the decision consciously instead of inheriting somebody else's fear and calling it your own conviction. And for me, that is a huge part of being spiritually rooted. I want to know why I believe what I believe. If conversations like this one are why you come to Awakened and Rooted, go ahead and subscribe. The shadow side of spirituality is going to be an ongoing series because I think there are a lot of things that we spiritually inherited that deserve a closer look. Not necessarily so we can throw them away, but so we can understand where they came from and decide for ourselves what we actually believe. All right, let's keep going. Now, here's the other side of this, because we can talk all day about colonization, disrupted ancestral traditions, but modern spiritual reclamation has its own issues. And I think we have to be just as willing to look at that. Not everything labeled on social media as ancestral is ancestral. Not everything labeled African spirituality comes from the same place. Africa is enormous. We are talking about different cultures with their own practices and their own histories. And some of these traditions never disappeared at all. There are people practicing them today. There are communities that have protected those traditions for generations. So we have to be careful about treating somebody else's living religion like a spiritual buffet. You know, I like this from here. I like that from there. Let me grab this practice too. Now, suddenly we've invented something and called it ancestral because it feels ancient. That doesn't mean people shouldn't explore their ancestry. I think that exploration can be amazing, but I also think there's something very spiritual about humility. Sometimes the answer is, I'm still learning. I'm still learning. And sometimes the answer is, I don't know if this practice belongs to my lineage. And sometimes we have to accept that something was lost. You don't honor your ancestors by making up the missing practices. So, did colonization erase ancestral spirituality? I don't think the answer is simply yes. I think it disrupted it. I think it changed it. I think some things were lost forever, and I think other things survived in ways we may not immediately recognize. They became family traditions. They blended into other religions. They showed up in music, healing, burial practices, storytelling. They became the things that people did without remembering why. And that may be one of the strangest things about culture. You can take away the explanation, and sometimes the practice still finds a way to stay. That's why I say colonization didn't necessarily erase ancestral spirituality. Some of it went underground. And generations later, some of us may be standing over the ground asking, what's still down there? So here's what I want to know from you. Is there something that your family did when you were growing up that you didn't realize it was unusual until you got older? Maybe you still don't know where it came from. I would love to hear about that in the comments. And I also want you to sit with a bigger question from this video. Who taught you that spirituality was acceptable? Not what do you believe now? Who taught you? Because those are two different questions. And sometimes figuring out the answer to the first one changes the way you think about the second. This is definitely not going to be our last conversation about colonization and spirituality. There is way too much here, and I already know there are places we barely touch today. But I think this is a good place to start. Until next time, Rooted Collective, stay curious, stay grounded, and don't be afraid to examine where your beliefs came from. I will see you in the next one.